N.T. Wright, professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at St. Andrews University, wrote a March 29, 2020 editorial for Time magazine. The title of this editorial is "Christianity Offers No Answers About the Coronavirus. It's Not Supposed to." In the editorial, he says, "No doubt the usual silly suspects will tell us why God is doing this to us. A punishment? A warning? A sign? These are knee-jerk would-be Christian reactions in a culture which generations back embraced rationalism. Everything must have an explanation. But supposing it doesn't? Rationalists, including Christian rationalists, want explanations. Romantics, including Christian romantics, want to be given a sigh of relief. But perhaps what we need more than either is to recover the biblical tradition of lament. Lament is what happens when people ask why and don't get an answer. It's where we get to when we move beyond our self-centered worry about our sins and failings and look more broadly at the suffering of the world. Now, I'm here to say that Mr. Right would be better named Mr. Wrong, because Christianity does offer solutions. It does offer answers as to why these things happen. Let me explain. The two current theories about the origin of the coronavirus was, number one, a wet market in Wuhan. Now, wet markets are places where they sell exotic animals. They have live animals there, and they kill them on the spot, and they're all mixed together, and they are a mixing bowl for all kinds of pathogens. The conventional wisdom is that SARS, that broke out in 2002 and mostly in 2003 and continued for a while into 2004, began at a wet market. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. But the other theory is that Wuhan has a biolab, actually a couple of them there, but a level 4 biolab that handles very hazardous material, and that they were studying the coronavirus from a bat species, the horseshoe bat, and that somehow one of the workers was infected and got out, and it got into the general population. Now, you can pick and choose which one you want to believe, but whether you choose one or the other, it's interesting, it goes back to the bat. Either way. And we'll allow the scientists and politicians and others to fight it out as to which one it was in terms of where it started, the biolab or the wet market. But the fact of the matter is it could very easily have come from either one of them. Now, what does this have to do with Christianity? Well, there are certain animals, such as bats and birds, that carry pathogens that can enter into human beings. And sometimes, for example, a bird flu, a human being can catch it, and they can be very deadly, sometimes as much as 70% mortality rate. And usually the person dies or gets better, and that's the end of it. But some of these pathogens, when they travel through an intermediary, especially such as a pig, which is a genetic mixing bowl for DNA, that it then, because it's so closely associated DNA-wise to a human being, can then transfer from human to human. And you get these pandemics. For example, in 1918, the Spanish flu, as it's called, was also known as the swine flu, because it is a flu that is found in both humans and swine. And they do believe, the best theory at this time, is that it began in Kansas, in the United States, in an area, a rural area with lots of swine or pigs. And it began there, but then it was transferred to a military camp there during the First World War, and from there it spread around the world. That's the leading theory at this time, but the point is that it came, no doubt, from a pig. It might have even started in a bird, which is transferred to a pig, but then from a pig to a human. Now, this is very significant. It's very important in the Christian context. We know that certain animals do carry these pathogens, and primary among them is the bat, and secondarily is the pig. For example, SARS, they believe, started in bats, but civet cats and pigs. Well, pigs may not be strange animals to most people, but civets are in this part of the world. But nevertheless, there was a chain reaction there. MERS, which is Middle East respiratory syndrome, they believe started with a bat, or bats, plural, transferred to camels someplace down the line, and then when people drink camel's milk and they eat camel's meat, or they process it, they are involved in the processing of camel's meat, this is how it got transferred to the human race, and then it can be transferred from person to person. The Nipah virus, they also believe started with bats. In this case, it was a fruit bat. And as the droppings go on into a pig's pen, or where pigs are found, they eat the droppings or fruit that's been dropped there. It transferred to a pig and then to humans. And it's a very, very deadly virus. It hasn't spread as wide as COVID-19, thankfully. It's not as contagious, but it does spread from human to human and has killed many hundreds of people there. Ebola is another one that they believe that the bat is the reservoir for it. And just as in China, in Africa, parts of Africa, West Africa, they eat bats. In China, they use them for traditional medicine, as well as eating bats. But the bat, they believe, is the reservoir. But when the fruit bat drops fruit on the floor of the jungle, then primates, such as monkeys, come along and they pick up the fruit and they eat it. And then people eat the primates. Now, again, why is this significant? Why is it so important that we talk about these things? We have swine flu. We have 1918, which was no doubt coming from a swine as well, or a pig. They believe in Kansas, the best they know. But why is it important that we know these things in the Christian context? If we go back to the Bible, Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, we find that Moses taught the children of Israel that there are certain animals that they shouldn't eat. And really it wasn't Moses, because it was instructions from God to tell Moses to teach the people these things. And we can ridicule this all that we want to. But the fact of the matter is that there are certain animals that are indicated there that we're not to eat. They're not for human consumption. And they're called unclean, an abomination. And among those animals are the bat, the pig, the camel, and primates, civet cats, and virtually all these animals that we find are transmitting them to humans that can be transmitted from human to human. It's the unclean animals that do these things. You know, I'm not some Johnny-come-lately who just discovered Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14. I first learned about these things in the early 60s. And I thought that the wisdom of it was that they carry pathogens that I could get if I eat it. For example, the pig carries the trichinosis worm. And many thousands of people around the world, even to this day, are sickened by it, and many die. Because trichinosis is a very, very difficult pathogen to deal with. Actually, it's a parasite to deal with. So I thought that that was one of the major reasons. And the pig also is a very fat animal. It's a very unclean animal because it lives in very unclean environments. And I always thought of it as something that is primarily, I shouldn't eat it because I could get sick from it. But only in more recent years, in the early 2000s, when SARS occurred, did I begin to study a little bit more on this, and found that it isn't just a matter of the pig and me. It's a matter of somebody on the other side of the world eating these creatures that God said don't eat, and they get sick, and then they pass it to the rest of the human race. So did God know what he was talking about when he said, leave these animals alone, don't eat them? And yet human beings still do. Now let me ask you this. Why is it that professing Christian ministers are in the leadership of saying that, oh, these laws in Leviticus and Deuteronomy don't amount to anything? They were just for the Jews back then. It was something that Moses came up with. Well, you know, it's interesting that it goes long before Moses, because we can go all the way back to the flood account in the 6th chapter, or actually 7th chapter of the book of Genesis, when we read about the flood account and Noah. And Noah was to take 2 of the unclean animals aboard the ark. People know that, but they don't know that he was to carry by 7s the clean animals aboard the ark. So even Noah knew the difference between a clean animal and an unclean animal. And so it wasn't something that came up with Moses. It was something that goes back way before Moses. Now, why do Christian ministers then say that these Old Testament laws are no longer in effect? Well, frankly, the answer is that they're mistranslating or misunderstanding certain scriptures. They take Mark, the 7th chapter, where it's talking about the disciples did not wash their hands the way that the Pharisees said that they had to before they ate. And so it's talking about unclean hands or eating with unwashed hands. And it has nothing to do with clean and unclean meats, although the translators tried to slip that in by saying in one verse that thus he declared all meats clean, which is really not in the original. It should be thus purifying all foods or meats. In other words, the body takes care of it. We put it in the mouth, it goes out the draught, and it takes care of it there. But in Matthew's account, we read that he said, these are things that defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. It makes it very clear that that's the whole subject of it. Then over in Acts, the 10th chapter, we see that there was a sheet let down from heaven, and Peter saw the sheet in a dream or a vision, and it had all kinds of unclean animals on it, and a voice came and said, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." But what was Peter's reaction? Well, first of all, Peter was there with the unwashed hands incident, and this is many years later, and he says, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And then in verse 28 of Acts, the 10th chapter, we see that the meaning of it is that he should not call any man common or unclean. These are just a couple examples of how they take scriptures and they take them totally out of the context of the whole Bible, and they run with it and say, oh, we can eat whatever we want to. So it really doesn't matter, does it? Well, why don't you tell that 50 to 100 million people that died worldwide from the swine flu, better known as the Spanish flu, but it was a swine flu. Why don't we tell them about it? All the children that weren't born. Why don't we tell the people in Italy and Spain and New York City and elsewhere around this world, including China, that it really doesn't matter what we eat or what we handle or what we deal with? Tell all the victims of SARS that it doesn't matter what we eat. No, it does matter. You know, God gave mankind a choice at the very beginning. In the Garden of Eden, there were 2 trees. One symbolized the tree of life, the other symbolized the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And when Adam and Eve chose that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they were saying to God, we want to determine for ourselves what is right and what is wrong. We want to determine for ourselves what is good to eat and what isn't, instead of allowing God to reveal those truths to us. In the book of Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah has something to say about this. He talks about our ways today and the result of them. He says, your own wickedness will correct you, and your backslidings will rebuke you. Know therefore and see that it is an evil and bitter thing that you have forsaken the Lord your God, and the fear of me is not in you. No, we don't fear God. We don't respect God. We reject his laws. Then these things happen and we say, oh, we don't know what happened. We can't explain it. NT wrong. He's wrong. There is an explanation. We just have to open our eyes and look at the facts. This is Gerald Weston for Tomorrow's World.